cultures. There are status and rank and age that may make big differences. There are masculine and feminine cultures, individual and collective orientations, and different time orientations. But there's no way I can talk about all of that, so I'm going to start with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or Whorfian hypothesis or whatever that I usually explain as language influences perception. And we can all understand that, but I was lucky enough when I was 25 to have the experience of living for 2 years in Taiwan. And I learned a few things about Taiwan, but I learned a whole lot more about my own background and what my experiences led me to see and to focus on. So I want to give you some illustrations of these that we can talk about. The first, apparently we don't have an audio hookup, so I'll just tell you about this little 2-minute presentation I was going to mention. Some of you may have heard it. It was Robert W. Krulwich talking with Lera Borodinsky on National Public Radio. Lera Borodinsky is a language specialist. And she briefly summarized her research. She had groups of Spaniards and Germans talk about the word bridge, which in German is feminine noun, and in Spanish is a masculine noun. So we don't have that in English, but we're all familiar with the idea that different languages have masculine and feminine nouns. What she found was that when she asked the German speakers what bridges were like, they told her they were beautiful, elegant, expansive. And when she asked the Spanish speakers what bridges were like, they came up with strong, towering, and other ideas. So when we learn a language, we're not just learning how to order dinner in France or wherever we are. We're learning a different way of thinking, which is why it's so important to have that experience. So Spanish speakers are Spanish thinkers, German speakers are German thinkers, and we need to consider what kind of thinkers we are, and to realize that other people think very, very differently. The presentation I just heard from or attended, someone talked about logic being the same all over the world. No, no, no. Western logic is different from Eastern logic. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about low and high context communication styles. You've heard of those from the other presenters, but these I want to go a little bit more specific. The USA is a good example of a low context culture. And by that, what we mean is that most of the meaning in the US and Western European conversations is conveyed in the words. So what's important is the content, not the context. So what that means is verbal messages are very important, self-expression is valued, and speech tends to be clear and direct. Whereas in Asia, and I checked with May, and she told me that India also qualifies as a high context culture. So
and Africa too.
Africa too, okay. Africa, it may depend on which nation, I don't know.
Countries.
But,
Okay.
But high context culture, the meaning is not in the words. The meaning is in the surroundings. Very often there may not be words, and you're supposed to intuit, and someone from those cultures can intuit what is being said. There's also a value for relational harmony, and speech tends to be ambiguous. It's very difficult, I know, in Chinese to say no. In English, it's very easy to say no. In English, I'm told, because it comes from classical Greek, there are a lot of prefixes that convey opposites. So you have order and disorder, things like that. The Chinese doesn't have. So I'm going to give you some examples of low and high cultural communication, and I'll need the help from people in the audience who are from these different cultures to help me identify this. That just says what I've said before. And again, in high context cultures, and I'm saying this to the Westerners in the room, in high context cultures, what is unspoken is more important than what's said. Okay, this is a low context statement. I actually took it from a Charlie Brown cartoon, but because of intellectual property rights, I can't show the Charlie Brown cartoon, but you have to kind of imagine Charlie Brown talking to his pencil pal, and he's writing this letter. And in this letter, here I made it Sue and Nancy, you'll see why in a minute. Nancy says, "Dear Sue, how are you? I'm doing fine. My family is looking forward to spring. Sincerely, Nancy." So what does that mean to folks from a low context culture? I'm going to pick up my colleagues. Dr. Mayo, what does this mean to you?
That means the family's doing fine, the family's ready for it.
Yeah, it's kind of a bad letter, right? It doesn't say a lot. Look at this one. "Dear Sue, how are you? I'm doing fine. My family is looking forward to spring. Sincerely, Yang." Now I need Chinese members of the audience to help me out. What does this letter mean? Dr. Beck?
Because this letter is written in red, that means I don't want to see you ever again.
This is a Dear John letter. It doesn't matter what it says. It could say, "I had toast for breakfast." What it matters is that it's written in red. That's the context. And the context overwhelms the content for a Chinese culture. So when a Chinese person sends that, I found out about this because I have a good Chinese friend who once made the mistake of writing a letter to his mother in red because he was in graduate school here and it was just what he happened to pick up. And she called him up from China and blessed him out immediately as soon as she got that letter. And he had never been taught that. But this is a way to break off a relationship in a high context culture. So this, I think, is a pretty good example of how low and high context cultures can look at the same information and have very different meanings for that information. So language and culture act like sunglasses to color our worlds. When you put on a pair of sunglasses with blue lenses, everything's a little bit blue. When you put on sunglasses with gold or brown lenses, everything's a little bit gold or brown. So what do we do about this? Well, you heard a lot about different kinds of training that can take place, but I'm just going to hit the highlights. Number one, in intercultural situations, we need to expect uncertainty and ambiguity. We need to seek feedback, and we need to check our perceptions, meaning, I think you mean that your family would like to see me. Is that really what your letter means? So talking to people face to face and asking questions to check that you understand what they were trying to get across. Recognize differences, and certainly there are differences between cultures, but there are also differences within cultures. My experience in China, or in Taiwan, was very different from my experience in Boston, Massachusetts, and I've lived there for probably 20 years out of the last 30. And I always felt much more at home in Taiwan. Why? Because I was born in the U.S. South, and there are a lot of common cultural elements in Taiwan and in the U.S. South. Whereas Boston, I had thought would be like Alabama, where I was born. No. Yes, Boston's conservative, and yes, Alabama's conservative, but they're conservative on two totally different topics. And it's also important to realize that you may be looking at the same piece of information and understanding it very, very differently. So in general, what I advise is that you adjust your communication to the others' communication rules and customs. It's always easier to change ourselves than to change other people. So if you change, obviously if you're meeting someone who's interculturally sensitive, they'll change to meet you. But on the chance that you don't, if you change to adapt, then the interaction will be much more successful. Thank you.
Thank you.